I didn't hear the break-in. I felt it. That strange pressure in the air, that sense that someone was inside my home who absolutely shouldn't be. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. The HOA president. Not at a meeting, not on the sidewalk, but inside my hallway, wearing my robe. She was strolling through my house like she owned the place. Lights on, thermostat changed, her bags unpacked in my guest room. She didn't even flinch when she saw me. Instead, she raised my own deed, the deed I fought years to secure, and said with the calm confidence of someone used to winning, "This paper doesn't count anymore. Under HOA occupancy law, this home now falls under my authority." Then she pointed to the new locks she'd installed, her voice dripping with victory. "You really should have attended the meetings." But what she didn't know was that she had just activated a boundary the HOA has zero power over, a boundary backed by county law, state statute, and evidence that would burn her entire presidency to the ground. Before I show you how fast her empire collapsed, tell me, has an HOA ever tried to erase your rights? I worked years for this house, late nights, side gigs, meals skipped, just to save another $50. Nothing about my life was handed down. I didn't inherit comfort. I built it brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, until the day I finally held the keys in my hand and felt like I'd carved out a small corner of peace in a noisy world. This place was supposed to be the first quiet chapter of my life, a home where stress stopped at the front door and where silence had value again. But the neighborhood had its own rhythm, and it didn't take long to notice how people paused before speaking, how they glanced over their shoulders as if someone else was always listening. The HOA president's smile was the first red flag, too tight, too polished, stretching across her face like a warning disguised as hospitality. Whenever she welcomed someone, her eyes stayed cold, calculating, measuring them as if deciding whether they belonged. Neighbors whispered her name with the kind of caution people reserve for storms. They said she liked order, but her version of order felt more like ownership. She insisted I check in before making even the smallest changes, speaking as though she held rights over every inch of my life. Every conversation carried a reminder that she was the one who set the rules. Back then, I thought the worst she could do was fine me or tape a few warnings to my door. I had no idea her obsession with control ran deeper than paperwork or power trips. I didn't know she'd try to erase my deed or move into my home as if I didn't exist. My name is Daniel Ward, and by the time I hit my mid-30s, I'd already lived enough struggle for 2 lifetimes. I worked as an independent IT contractor, bouncing between jobs that demanded long nights, impossible deadlines, and constant proof that I was worth the rate I charged. Nothing came steady. Nothing came guaranteed, and every dollar I saved had claw marks on it, earned through exhaustion, missed weekends, and the kind of pressure that made my chest feel tight for years. But I kept going. I battled debt, rebuilt my credit, and dragged myself out of holes I didn't fall into by choice. I learned how to stretch money, how to negotiate, how to survive when everything felt like it could collapse with one unexpected bill. When I finally started gaining traction, steady clients, steady income, I told myself one thing: I would buy a home that no one could take from me. This house wasn't luxury. It wasn't some dramatic dream mansion. It was better than that. It was mine. Every wall, every screw, every echo in the hallway belonged to me. It felt like stepping into adulthood with both feet planted firmly on solid ground for the first time. I stood in the empty living room on day one, sunlight cutting across the floor, and whispered to myself, I earned every brick of this place. And I meant it. This wasn't just a house, it was stability, independence, proof that my years of grinding had led somewhere. For once life felt quiet enough for me to breathe. Peace finally felt possible. I just didn't know that someone else, the woman running the HOA, looked at everything I'd built and decided it should belong to her instead. The house sat on a slightly larger lot than the others on the street, just enough extra space to feel like freedom without announcing itself. The street was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like noise knew better than to travel here. The first time I walked the property, the breeze moved through the hedges with this soft hush that made everything in me slow down. After years of apartments, roommates, and temporary rentals, standing on ground that could actually belong to me felt unreal. I could see potential everywhere: an office in the spare room, a deck out back, maybe even a small workshop if I played my cards right. Nothing fancy, just possibilities I could build with my own hands. When I finally moved in, I remember the exact moment it hit me. It was late, the house still half empty, boxes stacked against the walls, and I was lying on the floor with a blanket because I hadn't bought a bed yet. The air smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. My heartbeat echoed louder than the silence, but it wasn't anxiety this time, it was pride. A quiet, pulsing pride that warmed my chest and made the empty room feel full. In the days that followed, I touched every part of that house myself. Every screw tightened, every bulb replaced, every cabinet door adjusted with the stubbornness of someone who refused to outsource anything that mattered. The work didn't tire me, it anchored me. This was my real win, something solid, lasting, and fully earned. I didn't know then that someone else believed they had more claim to my home than I did. Someone who hadn't lifted a finger for it, yet felt entitled to everything inside its walls. I met her on my second morning in the neighborhood, just as I was unloading tools from my truck. I remember the sharp clink of her bracelets before I saw her too shiny, too polished, catching sunlight in a way that felt almost intentional. When she approached, her heels tapped the pavement like she wanted every house on the block to know she was making an entrance. She smiled, but it stopped halfway across her face, never reaching the eyes that studied me like I was an item on a checklist. "Welcome to our community," she said, stretching the word "our" as if she were granting me temporary permission to breathe the air here. She introduced herself with the confidence of someone announcing royalty. "I'm Marlene, HOA president, not neighbor, not resident, president." Her gaze drifted over my truck, pausing long enough to sting. "Most homeowners here prefer more refined vehicles." Then she nodded toward my lawn where a few leaves were scattered. "We do keep high standards," and as if she needed one more jab to complete her ritual, she gestured lightly toward my mailbox. "The previous one was understated. Hopefully you'll maintain that." Each comment was dipped in sweetness, but the aftertaste was unmistakable. She wasn't welcoming me, she was measuring me, testing me, trying to see whether I'd been. The entire interaction lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt longer. The way she spoke, the way she stood, the way her eyes roamed, it all carried one message. She believed this neighborhood was her kingdom, and the rest of us were tenants in her imaginary empire. She spoke like she owned the entire block. And maybe in her mind she truly believed she did. It didn't take long to notice the way people behaved in this neighborhood. Conversations weren't casual, they were calculated. Neighbors spoke in soft, clipped tones, especially when standing on porches or near open windows, as if sound itself might betray them. I'd see curtains flutter the moment footsteps approached, voices dropping instantly, a quiet warning parsing between them without a single word spoken. It was strange at first, then unsettling once I understood why. They whispered about consequences, real ones. One neighbor told me in a hushed voice, she punished the Thompsons for questioning a landscaping fee. Another added, "We don't bring up concerns, not unless we're ready to pay for it." And they meant it literally. People told stories like they were passing down survival tips, folk tales built from fines and fear. There was the family forced to repaint their entire house because Marlene claimed the color leaned too cheerful. Another homeowner received weekly harassment letters accusing him of breaking rules that didn't even exist. One man confessed he was fined 3 separate times for imaginary boundary violations, each one increasing in severity until he finally stopped resisting and just paid. Every story shared the same thread: challenge her, and she'd find a way to make you regret it. I'd walk down the street and feel eyes lingering from behind blinds. Residents watching me the way someone watches a new animal entering dangerous territory. They weren't unfriendly, they were scared, conditioned, careful. The more I listened, the more the picture sharpened. Marlene didn't care about community or standards. She cared about power, absolute, unquestioned, meticulously enforced power. "She doesn't run the HOA," an older neighbor whispered one evening, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "She rules it." My house wasn't just a roof over my head, it was the backbone of my entire life. My home office sat in the room facing the backyard, filled with equipment I'd spent years collecting: servers, monitors, routers, backups, tools that weren't just expensive, they were essential. Every contract I worked on depended on that setup. Every client trusted me because I had a workspace built for precision and reliability. Losing access to this house meant losing my income overnight. 2 more rooms held gear I'd saved months to afford, locked behind reinforced doors because I couldn't risk even a minor setback. One damaged system, one stolen hard drive, and everything I'd built would collapse. Stability wasn't a luxury for me, it was survival. My routines, my workflow, my peace of mind all lived inside these walls. And the mental stability that came with having a place of my own, that was priceless. After years of moving from rental to rental, finally having a permanent address felt like stepping onto solid ground after a lifetime of storms. This space gave me room to think, breathe, plan, and rebuild myself. That's what made Marlene dangerous. She wasn't issuing warnings because she cared about compliance. She wasn't pointing out leaves on my lawn or mailbox angles because she valued order. She wanted something much simpler: domination, submission, control over every homeowner until they stopped seeing their property as theirs and started seeing it as hers. If she took my house, she'd take everything tied to it: my job, my stability, and every piece of peace I'd fought to earn. The first violation showed up 3 days after my move-in. A bright yellow slip taped to my door, the kind of color chosen specifically to embarrass someone. It claimed my trash bins were improperly positioned, even though they were exactly where the welcome packet instructed. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a clerical mistake. But the second notice arrived the very next morning, this time accusing me of unapproved lawn conditions. I stared at the sentence for a full minute, trying to figure out what that even meant. Then the photos started. Each violation came with a picture taken from angles that made my skin crawl: inside the hedges, behind the mailbox, from the narrow gap between my fence and the neighbor's garage. Someone was hiding on my property to manufacture problems. One slip claimed my lawn was the wrong shade of green, a phrase so ridiculous I almost laughed until I realized they were serious. According to the president's handwritten note at the bottom, community harmony requires aesthetic consistency. Her tone shifted with every notice, growing colder, sharper, more confident. Immediate correction required. Failure to comply will escalate fees. This behavior reflects poorly on neighborhood standards. Each message felt less like a request and more like a threat. Within a week, I had a stack of violations thick enough to pass as a small book. Everything was suddenly an offense: my porch light being too warm, my house numbers being slightly off-center, a leaf blower sitting on my lawn for longer than necessary. It didn't matter if I fixed the issue or proved it wasn't real. The goal wasn't accuracy, it was pressure. Every morning became a new episode of the same harassment campaign, carefully crafted and personally delivered. It was clear she wasn't documenting problems, she was creating them. The first time I noticed the camera, it wasn't the device itself that caught my attention. It was the faint red blink reflecting off my windshield as I pulled into the driveway. A new security unit had been mounted on the community pole across from my house, angled with suspicious precision, not toward the street, not toward traffic, but directly at my driveway, my front door, and the windows of my home office. The lens followed my movements with an unsettling stillness, like an unblinking eye waiting for me to slip. I asked around, but no one else had received notice of new surveillance. No updates from the HOA, no community email, just this camera, perfectly placed to monitor only me. When I confronted Marlene about it during one of her morning patrols, she didn't even pretend to hide her satisfaction. "It's for community safety," she said, adjusting her too shiny bracelet as if the light bouncing off it gave her more authority. "We've had concerns." "Concerns about what?" I asked. She smiled. The kind of smile predators wear when they think the prey still hasn't realized it's trapped. "Compliance. And ensuring everyone meets expectations." The next incident erased any doubt about her intentions. One afternoon, I heard the side gate creak, a sound that shouldn't have been possible because I'd locked it earlier. I stepped outside quietly and saw her halfway through my side yard, camera in hand, snapping photos of the space between my AC unit and the fence. "What are you doing?" I demanded. She didn't startle, she didn't apologize. She simply straightened, slid her phone into her pocket, and said, "Routine inspection." "You can't be on my property." She dismissed the boundary with a flick of her hand. "Compliance is not optional." I held her gaze, letting the anger sharpen my voice. "Neither is privacy." For the first time, her smile dropped. Just a fraction, enough to reveal the irritation behind her mask. Irritation that I wasn't folding the way others did. After that, the camera's red light seemed to blink more aggressively. The gate clicked mysteriously at odd hours. Shadows lingered near hedges where no one should have been standing. The message was unmistakable. She wasn't just watching me. She was hunting for leverage. The shift in the neighborhood was subtle at first, little pauses in conversation when I walked by, doors closing a bit faster, smiles fading before they fully formed. Then it hardened into something unmistakable. People stopped making eye contact. Parents pulled their kids closer when I stepped onto the sidewalk, guiding them to the opposite side of the street with gentle but deliberate hands. The same neighbors who once waved while gardening now pretended not to hear me when I said hello. It didn't take long to understand why. Rumors started circulating, spreading with the quiet efficiency of a practiced whisper network. "He's aggressive," someone murmured loud enough for me to hear as I walked to my mailbox. "He threatened the board," another voice said from behind a cracked window. "He's not following standards," a man told his wife while staring directly at my house as though the siding itself were committing a crime. It was like watching my reputation erode grain by grain, each lie stacking neatly on top of the last. Marlene didn't confront me directly. She didn't have to. She simply planted the seeds, and the neighborhood's fear did the rest. Kids who once rode scooters down the sidewalk now made wide arcs around my driveway, whispering to each other with eyes full of caution, as if stepping too close might trigger some hidden danger. One afternoon, a mother grabbed her daughter's wrist so abruptly the girl stumbled, just because I stepped outside holding a toolbox. A few days later, while taking out the trash, an older neighbor approached me carefully, glancing around as though someone might be watching. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "She told us you were dangerous," he said, guilt tugging at his mouth. I didn't believe it, but people listened to her. "They're scared of her." I nodded, though the words tightened something deep in my chest. Marlene wasn't just issuing fines or snooping around my property anymore. She was rewriting who I was in this neighborhood, turning me from a homeowner into a threat. And in a community ruled by fear, that was the most powerful weapon she could use. The harassment stopped being subtle the moment my property started falling apart, piece by piece. It began with my lawn equipment, tools I kept neatly stored in the small shed behind the house. One morning I found the door slightly ajar, the lock twisted as if someone had forced it. Inside, my mower's cord had been sliced clean through, the trimmer line ripped out and the blower's battery missing entirely. It looked less like theft and more like a message carved into metal and plastic. 2 days later, I turned on the sprinklers and watched water shoot sideways like a broken fountain. Several heads had been snapped at the base, jagged plastic left behind like torn limbs. The damage was too precise to be accidental. Someone had walked my yard with intention. Then came the trash cans. I woke to the sound of something slamming against pavement. When I stepped outside, both cans were overturned in the middle of the street. Lids cracked, trash scattered like someone had kicked them repeatedly until the plastic surrendered. A neighbor peeked through their curtains but quickly disappeared before I could ask if they'd seen anything. I tried brushing it off, isolated incidents. Bad luck, maybe teenagers. But the real confirmation came the day my truck wouldn't start. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. A mechanic friend checked the tank and frowned. "Smells sweet," he said quietly. "That's sugar. Someone did this on purpose." The weight of it hit me hard. This wasn't inconvenience. This was escalation. Someone wanted to cripple my ability to work, to move, to stay. Later that afternoon, I saw Marlene strolling down the sidewalk with that familiar, controlled elegance. When her eyes met mine, she paused, tilting her head just enough to look sympathetic without meaning it. "Rough week?" she asked, letting the words drip with manufactured concern. "You could say that." She offered a small, satisfied smile, the kind that didn't bother pretending. "Maybe this neighborhood isn't a good fit for you." Her voice was soft, but the threat beneath it was sharp enough to cut. She didn't need to admit anything. She wanted me to understand, to feel cornered, to believe she controlled every inch of this place, including my future in it. And for the first time, I realized she wouldn't stop until I either submitted or disappeared. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Every night I lay awake listening for footsteps outside my windows, the creak of the side gate, the soft metallic rattle of the new camera shifting in the breeze. My mind wouldn't quiet. Every sound felt like a warning, every shadow a potential intrusion. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding against my ribs, as if trying to escape my chest. Rest stopped being restful. It became another battlefield, and with no sleep came mistakes. My work began slipping through my fingers. Deadlines crept closer while my concentration drifted farther. I'd reread the same line of code over and over, unable to make sense of it. Clients called, asking if everything was okay, and I'd lie just a busy week because admitting the truth felt humiliating. How could I explain that a homeowner association president was destroying my professional life without ever touching my job? The worst part wasn't the sabotage or the violations or the rumors. It was the feeling that my home, my sanctuary, my hard-won stability was no longer safe. I walked from room to room with a tension in my shoulders that never eased, checking locks twice, then checking them again. I'd sit at my desk and catch myself staring at the door, waiting for it to move. I hated that she'd made me this paranoid, this small, this unsure. It felt like she was slowly tightening a noose around my life. Not enough to kill me outright, but enough to make every breath a little harder, every day a little heavier. and no matter how much I tried to fight the feeling, one truth kept echoing in my mind. If I didn't push back soon, she was going to take everything from me. Most homeowners don't realize how limited an HOA's actual authority is. The rules they mail out, the warnings they tape to doors, the threats they mutter during meetings. They only work because people don't know where the boundaries truly are. But I'd spent years working with clients in property tech and compliance systems. I knew exactly where the lines were drawn, and more importantly where they couldn't cross. An HOA cannot enter private property. Not the yard, not the side gate, not a single inch past the boundary line without written permission. They also have zero power to modify those boundaries. They can't redraw a map, extend their authority, or pretend a fence sits somewhere it doesn't just because it benefits them. They have absolutely no legal right to declare occupancy. An HOA president can't claim a home, can't assume possession, and can't rewrite ownership documents no matter how many titles she holds on her board. And surveillance? Completely restricted. An HOA cannot install or direct cameras facing into private spaces, driveways, windows, backyards, office rooms. That's not community safety, that's invasion. Most homeowners learn this too late, but I knew these rules before I ever moved in, and knowing them meant I also knew exactly how badly Marlene was overstepping. I came home earlier than usual that day, exhausted from a morning meeting that ended sooner than expected. As I walked up the driveway, something felt off. An instinctive stiffness in the air, like the house was bought its breath. The blinds were slightly tilted, not the way I'd left. The porch light, which I kept off during the day, flickered faintly as if someone had tried the switch. When I reached the back door, the unease solidified into certainty. The latch hung crooked, metal bent inward, the wood around it splintered in thin, deliberate lines. Someone hadn't just tampered with it, they'd forced it. My stomach tightened as I pushed the door open, heart thudding hard enough to drown out the creak. Inside, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. A chair moved slightly off its mark, a coaster flipped upside down. Mail that had been stacked neatly on the counter now fanned out like someone had rifled through it. And the worst part, the detail that made my skin crawl, was the scent hanging in the air. Perfume. Sweet, floral, unmistakably hers. Marlene wore a signature fragrance, one strong enough to announce her arrival before she spoke. I'd endured it during every interaction, but inside my home it felt invasive, clinging to the walls like a fingerprint. I walked further in, each step heavier than the last. My office door was ajar. A cabinet that I always kept locked sat slightly open. No valuables were missing, no electronics taken. She hadn't come to steal. She'd come to inspect, to observe, to make her presence known without leaving a traditional trace. But she did leave something, a folded HOA violation flyer, placed neatly on my kitchen counter, the top line reading "Urgent Compliance Required." It wasn't taped to the door or slid under the mat like usual. It was left where she knew I'd see it instantly. A calling card. A warning. A declaration. As I stood there in the center of my violated home, the truth hit me with a cold clarity I couldn't ignore. That was the moment I realized she wasn't trying to control me. She was trying to remove me. The night after I discovered the break-in, I sat at my dining table surrounded by every document I had ever collected when buying the house. Paperwork I hadn't touched in years, closing packets, survey reports, boundary maps, county filings. I spread them out like evidence in a case I hadn't realized I'd been building. My hands shook, not from fear this time, but from something sharper. Determination. If Marlene wanted a war, then I needed ammunition she couldn't twist. Not the copy I kept in my office, not the condensed digital version, the full, initial county-issued deed printed before the HOA was ever formed. The date sat at the top like a spotlight, property rights established 3 years prior to the HOA's incorporation, meaning legally, structurally, indisputably. My land existed outside their governance. They could suggest rules, they could send letters, but they could not enforce anything. My lot had been grandfathered without even needing the term, because it existed first. I flipped to the accompanying boundary survey, pages crackling as I unfolded the large sheet. The lines were clear, bold, unmistakable. My lot extended 3 feet farther on the eastern side than the updated neighborhood map Marlene loved bragging about during inspections. I pulled out the HOA map from a welcome packet, laid it over the original survey, and let out a low, humorless laugh. The HOA version wasn't just different, it had been altered. The boundary line had been shifted, redrawn to give the HOA jurisdiction over land that wasn't theirs. My land, the land she'd been trespassing on. She had forged the neighborhood layout, adjusting borders to justify her harassment. It wasn't an error, it was deliberate. I checked signatures next county clerk versus HOA file. The county signature was crisp, verifiable, the kind that had a real official behind it. The HOA version? Sloppy. Printed, no stamp, no verification, a manufactured document disguised as authority. And just like that, everything snapped into place. She had committed fraud, boundary tampering, false jurisdiction claims, and legal enforcement. I had been playing defense without realizing I already held the winning piece. For months, she had tried to break me through intimidation, sabotage, and fear. She assumed I wouldn't know the laws. She assumed I wouldn't look deeper. She assumed I was just another homeowner too scared to push back. But now I had a deed older than her entire organization. A deed that stripped her of every weapon she'd used against me. A deed that turned her from a tyrant into a criminal. For the first time in months, I felt the pressure lift from my chest. I didn't just have a way out. I had leverage and the power to end her reign once and for all. Once I realized what the deed meant, what it truly stripped from her, I understood the next move had to be precise. Not emotional, not reactive, methodical. I needed proof that couldn't be twisted, denied, or drowned beneath another pile of forged HOA paperwork. So I spent the next 48 hours turning my home into a quiet, legal snare. I installed cameras where she wouldn't think to look. Tiny, wide-angle units tucked behind vents, embedded in shelves, and positioned above door frames. Not just for the doorways, but for the hallways, the office, the back entry, and the side gate she loved slipping through. Every angle covered, every possible point of intrusion ready to record. Then I called someone I trusted, Micah, an old friend and property lawyer who'd handled cases involving HOA overreach before. When he arrived and I showed him the deed, the forged maps, the boundary discrepancies, he let out a low whistle. "She's in deep," he said, eyes scanning each page. "If she steps foot inside again, you'll have her on multiple counts." "Good," I replied. "I'm counting on it." But a witness wasn't enough. I needed a second layer, someone official. So I contacted a county land use officer I'd worked with during a tech compliance project. He agreed to stop by the next afternoon, off the record, just to observe. If she enters without permission, he told me, that's all I need to see. The plan was simple: make the house look empty. I parked my truck 2 blocks away, turned off all lights, and left through the back, locking the deadbolt behind me. Then I waited in Micah's car across the street, the cameras streaming live to my phone. It didn't take long. Less than an hour later, Marlene strutted up the walkway with a tote bag, a clipboard, and the casual confidence of someone entering their weekend getaway. She unlocked my side gate, slipped inside, and walked through my back door like she owned it. This time, she didn't just snoop. She unpacked clothes, toiletries, a laptop, a mug she placed in my kitchen cabinet. She wasn't inspecting anymore. She was moving in. Micah made the call the moment she crossed the threshold with her tote bag slung over her shoulder like she was returning from a weekend retreat. The county officer waited beside us, arms folded, expression unreadable as he watched her on the live feed wander through my living room, humming softly while rearranging my things. She set her laptop on my desk, placed her shoes neatly by the couch, and opened drawers, as if cataloging what would soon be hers. When the sheriff's vehicle finally pulled up, its lights silent but unmistakable, I felt the first flicker of real relief in months. 3 of us walked up together, me, Micah, and the county officer. No one knocked. The sheriff opened the already unlatched door and stepped inside with the authority of someone who'd handled every kind of nonsense imaginable. Marlene was in my kitchen, pouring water into a glass she'd taken from my cabinet. She froze mid-pour when she saw the sheriff, then straightened her posture but didn't step away from the counter. "Ma'am," the sheriff said calmly, "I need you to explain why you're inside this residence." Her voice snapped into a rehearsed confidence. "This property is under HOA reclamation," she said, gesturing toward the open living room. "He forfeited the property by non-compliance." I stepped forward. I didn't forfeit anything. She didn't even acknowledge me. "Per our bylaws," she continued, "extended non-compliance triggers community reassignment. I initiated occupancy to stabilize the property. It's all perfectly legal." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this isn't medieval Europe. You can't claim land by squatting." Her jaw tightened. "I am the HOA president." "And this," Micah interjected, holding up the original deed, "predates your entire organization, which means you have no jurisdiction. None. And entering this home is breaking and entering." Her eyes darted to the documents, then to the sheriff, then to the county officer standing behind us. For the first time, the veneer cracked. A flicker of panic slipped through. The county officer unfolded the survey, laying it across the counter she'd just leaned on. "These are the actual boundaries," he said. "Your map doesn't match." "That's because," she began, but the sheriff cut her off. "Because you altered them?" he asked flatly. "Because you decided you had more authority than the county?" Her confidence evaporated. She stepped back, bumping into the drawer she'd left open. The glass in her hand trembled. "I was enforcing community standards," she said weakly. "No," I replied, meeting her eyes. "You were enforcing fantasy." The sheriff nodded once, turning toward her. "Ma'am, you need to come with me, right now." And in that moment, every ounce of power she'd built through fear collapsed into silence. Word spread faster than I expected. By the time the emergency HOA meeting was called, the community room was overflowing, residents lining the walls, crowding the doorway, murmur after murmur rippling through the air like a storm gathering its voice. People who once avoided eye contact with me now looked furious, not at me, but at the woman who had ruled them for years with a smile made of polished threat. Marlene sat at the front table, trying to maintain her usual posture of authority, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. The sheriff's presence at the back of the room didn't help. Neither did the county officer quietly reviewing documents beside him. The air felt charged, like everyone had been waiting far too long for this moment. The first neighbor to speak was Mrs. Alden, a soft-spoken woman I'd only ever seen tending roses. She stepped forward, gripping a stack of papers. "These," she said, voice shaking out loud, "are signatures she claimed were ours. But they're not. None of them match." She held the pages up for everyone to see. People gasped, realizing their names had been used without consent to pass new rules. Then Mr. Green, the retired accountant, rose next. "I reviewed the HOA financial statements," he said, "and there are withdrawals that have no explanation, no receipts, no records. Thousands of dollars." He paused, eyes hardening. "Funds she pocketed." Marlene flinched as though struck. A younger homeowner stood abruptly, phone in hand. "I have messages," he announced. "Text threats. She told me if I didn't repaint my house, she'd make my life complicated." He scrolled, holding the screen up. "Here, read them." Whispers exploded into outrage. People leaned closer, jaws tightening, eyes widening. The tone of the room shifted from unease to collective fury. "She fined me for a fence she said was 2 inches too tall." Someone shouted. "She told my husband she could get us removed." Another yelled. "She stalked my backyard," a woman near the front cried, voice trembling. The accusations poured out like a dam breaking, years of fear, humiliation, and silence finally ripping open. Every voice sharpened the picture of who she truly was, and with each revelation her authority crumbled further. Marlene stood, trying to restore control. "These are misunderstandings," she insisted, voice cracking. "I acted within my rights." "No," the crowd roared back, in near unison. The county officer held up the forged map. "You acted outside all rights." The room fell silent, heavy, decisive. For the first time, Marlene's eyes dropped, not out of humility, out of defeat. And in that crowded room, surrounded by people she once terrified, her empire finally collapsed. When the final accusation settled into the air, the sheriff stepped forward, the quiet scrape of his boots echoing through the tense room. Marlene looked around desperately, searching for even one sympathetic face, one person willing to stand with her. But the crowd, her former subjects, had turned to stone. No eyes softened, no voices rose in her defense. The kingdom she'd built from fear had evaporated the moment truth took its first breath. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, voice steady and absolute, "you need to come with me." She opened her mouth, but no words formed, only a small strangled sound, the gasp of someone realizing the game was over. He took her gently by the arm, but firmly enough that there was no mistaking the finality of it. As they walked toward the door, the room parted for them, residents stepping aside like witnesses to a fallen ruler being escorted from her own throne. On her way out, something unexpected happened. Members of the HOA board stood up one by one. No speeches, no excuses. They simply removed their pins, placed them on the table, and walked out in quiet shame. They had enabled her, defended her, and in some cases benefited from her abuses. Now stripped of her leadership, they were nothing more than bystanders to their own collapse. The county officer stepped forward to address the room. "Until further notice," he announced, "the HOA will be placed under temporary county oversight. All enforcement activities are suspended. New elections will be held after a full investigation." A wave of relief broke across the crowd, soft sighs, murmurs of disbelief, a few shoulders finally relaxing after years of tension. Neighbors who had remained silent for so long seemed to exhale at the same time, as though the entire community had been holding its breath under her rule. For the first time since I'd moved in, the neighborhood didn't feel hostile. It felt human again. People turned to one another, not in fear but in conversation, curiosity, maybe even hope. A few glanced at me with nods of gratitude or apology. The atmosphere that once felt suffocating finally loosened. And as the sheriff's car pulled away with Marlene inside, the whole neighborhood breathed for real. The days following Marlene's removal felt unreal, quiet, but not the peaceful kind. More like the moment after a storm when the air hangs heavy with everything that's been uprooted. The sheriff's department moved fast, faster than I expected for a case that started with HOA violations and ended with a full-scale unraveling of corruption. But once the evidence surfaced, videos, documents, forged maps, fraudulent signatures and testimonies from nearly half the neighborhood, the charges practically wrote themselves. The official list was longer than anyone imagined. Fraud came first, the backbone of her downfall. The altered boundary maps, the fictional amendments, the signatures she copied without permission, each page became a brick in the case built against her. County investigators found multiple versions of the same map, each one edited to give her more power than she ever legally possessed. All of it intentional, all of it criminal. Then came breaking and entering. The footage from my cameras showed everything. Her slipping through the gate, entering my home without permission, going through my belongings, unpacking her things as if preparing to settle in. There was no argument left for her lawyers to twist. Even the sheriff said, "I've seen bold, but this is a new category." Harassment charges followed swiftly. Dozens of residents stepped forward with stories they'd buried for years. Threatening texts, retaliatory fines, letters laced with intimidation, inspections done without notice. One man admitted he'd paid extra fees just to avoid conflict. Another said she told him he'd regret it if he didn't repaint his house. Their voices, quiet for so long, finally rose in unison, painting a clear picture of systematic abuse. Misuse of HOA funds was the final blow. The accountant neighbor, Mr. Green, provided meticulously documented discrepancies. Thousands of dollars withdrawn without justification, supplies purchased that never arrived. Community improvement fees funneled into accounts only she controlled. When investigators cross-referenced receipts, several didn't even exist. Others were handwritten and suspiciously vague. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was embezzlement. The courtroom hearing drew a crowd larger than most city council meetings. Residents packed shoulder to shoulder, some standing in the aisles, all waiting to hear the verdict. The judge reviewed the evidence with visible disdain, pausing multiple times to question how a neighborhood association had turned into a miniature dictatorship. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of resolution. Given the overwhelming evidence, he said, the court orders full restitution to the affected homeowners, mandatory repayment of misused funds, and permanent removal from any position of community authority. Then he held up my deed, the original document that started the tipping point. This property, he declared, was never under HOA control. Its boundaries were unlawfully misrepresented. The homeowner's rights are hereby reaffirmed and recorded publicly. Hearing those words felt like a knot loosening inside me, one I hadn't realized had become part of my body. The validation wasn't just legal, it was personal. It was the proof that everything I'd endured mattered, that every violation, every whisper, every moment of fear had been leading to this restoration of truth. As the gavel struck, the room exhaled, not just in relief but in closure. Justice, at last, had become real. In the weeks that followed the court hearing, the neighborhood transformed in ways I never imagined possible. It wasn't instant healing, rarely is, but there was a clear shift, like someone had opened the windows in a long-sealed house and let fresh air in. The fear that once clung to every porch and driveway began to lift, replaced slowly by a sense of curiosity, then relief, and finally something that felt like genuine community. The county oversight team took immediate control of the HOA's operations, and for the first time since I'd moved in, homeowners were invited, actually invited, to participate in open meetings. No closed-door sessions. No cryptic board decision. Everything was laid out plainly. Financial records, landscaping budgets, neighborhood concerns. Transparency wasn't a promise. It became a rule. Residents could vote on changes, propose amendments, and nominate new board members without worrying about retaliation. Oversight committees were formed to ensure no one person ever held unchecked power again. And with each passing day, people began reclaiming their courage. Neighbors who had once avoided me now crossed the street to talk, offering apologies that carried the weight of years. "I'm sorry we didn't say anything sooner," one woman admitted, wringing her hands. We were scared. Another man, the same one who previously repeated rumors about me, lowered his gaze. She told us things we shouldn't have believed. I hope you can forgive us. I didn't blame them. Fear is a powerful silencer, and Marlene had used it masterfully. But here now, those fears were dissolving. The most noticeable change came from the children. Kids who once made a wide arc around my driveway now zipped past on scooters, laughing as they raced each other down the street. Their parents didn't reel them back or shoot wary glances toward my house. Instead, they waved, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a small nod of gratitude. The street, once quiet in a way that felt suffocating, began filling with the natural noise of life, bikes skidding, basketballs bouncing, dogs barking with excitement instead of tension. Front yards that once looked uniform and sterile began to show personality. One neighbor planted colorful flowers she'd always wanted but never dared to display. Another finally installed the porch swing Marlene had fined him for planning. People stopped hiding their hobbies, their decorations, their individuality. Little by little, the neighborhood regained color. The atmosphere, once heavy with surveillance and suspicion, warmed. Conversations grew longer. Mailbox chats lasted more than a few seconds. People laughed more openly, shoulders relaxed, voices confident. For the first time, this didn't feel like a neighborhood ruled by a queen. It felt like a community shared by equals. And in witnessing all of it, the apologies, the new rules, the return of freedom, I realized something important. Marlene hadn't just tried to take my home, she'd stolen this community's spirit. And now, finally, they were taking it back. Cleaning up the damage Marlene left behind wasn't just a physical task, it was emotional, almost symbolic. It felt like taking back territory inch by inch, reclaiming not just my home but the pieces of myself she'd tried so hard to unravel. The first thing I tackled was the back door, the one she'd forced open like it was nothing more than a suggestion. I replaced the entire frame, not just the latch, reinforcing it with a steel plate that clicked shut with a satisfying certainty. Every turn of the screwdriver felt like a victory, every bolt driven deep, a reminder that control was mine again. Then came the locks. Every door, every window, every entry point she'd invaded or hovered near. I swapped them out for high-security smart locks, the kind that logged every open, every attempt, every second of usage. There was something incredibly grounding about it, watching the old locks drop into a box like discarded pieces of a chapter I no longer needed to fear. The new ones gleamed, precise and unapologetic, the way boundaries should always be. I upgraded the cameras too, not out of paranoia but out of principle. Hidden units were replaced with visible ones, cleanly mounted and aimed with intention. Not as a warning, but as a declaration: this house is protected, this space is mine, and no one walks in unnoticed again. For the first time in months, I felt the balance of power tilt solidly back in my direction. Outside, the yard told its own story of recovery. The damaged sprinklers were dug up and replaced, fresh lines laid, new heads installed. When the water finally arced across the lawn in clean, even streams, I stood there longer than necessary, watching it catch the sunlight like shards of glass. The grass, once patchy from sabotage, began to thicken again. I reseeded, fertilized, trimmed. Each small improvement felt like erasing her fingerprints from the soil she tried to claim. The garden was the last part I touched, the area near the hedges where she'd hidden to take her photos. I cleared the space thoroughly, pulled weeds, pruned branches, and planted flowers that added a quiet burst of color she would have hated. Bright reds, deep purples, untamed vine, life returning where her shadow once lingered. That small patch quickly became my favorite part of the yard, a reminder that beauty always finds its way back when control is finally removed. Inside, the house felt different too. Lighter. The silence didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt restful. The tension that once lived in my shoulders began to ease. My breathing changed. Even my footsteps sounded different on the hardwood, no longer cautious or heavy, but steady. And then finally, sleep returned. Not the fractured kind I'd been surviving on, but real sleep, the deep, dream-heavy kind that restores something in you no doctor can measure. The house no longer kept me awake with imagined threats. The night no longer felt like an enemy. Peace, once a fragile hope, became normal again. And standing in the middle of my restored home, with new locks, new life in the yard, and calm settling inside me, I realized something simple but powerful. She had tried to break me by taking my home, but fixing it piece by piece had rebuilt me instead. In the quiet that finally settled over my life, I found myself standing in rooms that felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Not because they were different, but because I was. The house hadn't changed, its walls hadn't moved, Its foundation hadn't shifted, but the weight pressing down on it had lifted. For the first time since moving in, I could walk through my own home without bracing for something to be out of place, without scanning corners for a shadow that didn't belong, without waiting for another violation slip to poison the day. And in that stillness, I began to understand what this battle had really been about. It wasn't just about a deed or boundaries or rules. It wasn't even about the crime she committed or the fear she tried to breed. At its core, this entire fight had been about courage, about the courage to stand up when staying quiet would have been easier, the courage to draw a line when someone believed they had the right to cross it, the courage to defend something that looked like property on paper but felt like dignity in reality. I had spent so much time thinking she was trying to take my house. But the truth was more invasive than that. She wanted control over my peace, my routines, my identity in this neighborhood. She wanted to rewrite who I was and where I belonged, and when I finally admitted that to myself, the anger I carried shifted into something more grounded, resolve. This wasn't just about my house, I realized one night as I stood at the kitchen window, watching the garden lights glow softly across the lawn. It was about refusing to be controlled. Boundaries aren't just physical. Sometimes they're the invisible lines that tell people where influence ends and autonomy begins. Mine had been trampled, mocked, ignored. And yet, every time she pushed harder, something inside me anchored deeper. Not because I enjoyed confrontation or wanted a fight, but because survival demanded it. Because letting her win, even once, would have meant surrendering far more than square footage. In reclaiming my home, I reclaimed that boundary. And something else happened too. Something I didn't expect. Neighbors who once shrank away now approached with respect. Not fear, not pity, but recognition. They had lived under her shadow longer than I had. They weren't weak, they were worn down. Seeing someone stand up to her gave them permission to breathe, to speak, to rebuild. The community wasn't healing because she was gone. It was healing because someone finally challenged the idea that she had the right to rule it all. As weeks passed, I felt the transformation take root inside me. The anxiety eased, the knots loosened. I stopped replaying every threat, every violation, every sleepless night. What remained was a deeper sense of self. A steadier footing I hadn't realized I'd lost. I wasn't just living in my home anymore. I was rooted in it. And one evening, as I locked the front door and heard the soft, secure click echo through the entryway, I understood the real victory. I hadn't just protected this place. I had protected the part of myself that refused to bow to intimidation. Control was never hers to claim, and dignity was never mine to lose. Have you ever faced an HOA nightmare? Tell your story below. Someone out there needs to hear it. Your experience might help another homeowner find the courage to push back, set boundaries, or defend their peace. Don't hold back, your voice could be the one that changes someone's entire fight. Share openly, the community learns, heals, and grows stronger through your bravery.